Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to a very special edition of L'Chaim. I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to sitting with my guest and to be talking with one of the world Jewry's foremost scholars and teachers of my favorite aspect of Jewish learning, Midrash. If you followed me at all, you know I love Midrash. My own rabbinate has been defined by my passion for Midrash, of teaching Midrash, whether in my own congregation of more than 45 years, longer than the children of Israel wandered in the desert on the way to the promised land, or whether here on JBS, or in our early days when this channel was called Shalom TV. Midrash is the portal into the mind and heart of the Jewish tradition. It's the window into the soul of the Jewish tradition, into the thinking, the imagination of the great sage rabbis who shaped what Judaism means to virtually all of us. You know, the most treasured gift the Jewish people have is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which is the wellspring out of which Jewish life flows. The Torah is our Eitz Chaim, our tree of life. The Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, from which Jews read every Shabbat in the synagogue, throughout the Jewish world, in every country and city and hamlet in which Jews live. We're all reading the same weekly section of the Torah, the same parasha or sedra, together every Shabbat, as well as on Mondays and Thursdays, and we treat the Sefer Torah with the love and care and respect one would accord a human being, a beloved. We carry the Torah, we dress the Torah, we kiss the Torah. We're careful how we touch the Torah. On Simchat Torah, we dance with the Torah. And we never discard a Sefer Torah, we bury the Torah as we would a beloved. The Torah is at the core of Jewish life. And in some way, every Jew understands that the Torah is a gift of the divine. To some, the Torah was literally given word for word at Mount Sinai and is the literal revelation of God. This view is known as Torah Sinai, Torah literally given to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. To many more Jews, the Torah is a magnificent document that flows out of the Jewish people's experience of the divine, with the great Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory described as the Jewish people's hearing, of the Jewish people's understanding of what we are to learn from the divine and how we are required to live. But the Torah is only the beginning. For the Jewish people, the Torah, the words of the 5 books of Moses, is only the start of Jewish learning. On Shabbat, we may hear the words of Torah being chanted from the Bimah, but the Jew is studying the rabbinic commentaries to the words of Torah. And 2 of the most important words in Jewish learning are the words Peshat and Drash. The Peshat refers to the plain meaning of the words of any Torah passage. The Drash refers to the rabbinic interpretation, understanding of what the words of the Torah mean. In the Jewish tradition, it's not what the Torah says. It's all about what the sage rabbis tell us the Torah means. As important as it is for Jews to know the Peshat of the Torah, it's more important to know the Drash, what the Jewish tradition understands the Torah text to mean. Almost every aspect of Judaism, as we know and experience it, whether one is an observant Jew or not, is a product of rabbinic interpretation of the Torah text. That's what the Jewish tradition really means by study. The Jew loves and reveres the Torah. The Jew studies Torah. The Torah refers to the words of the 5 books of Moses, contained in the Sefer Torah, from which we read every week in the synagogue. But Torah refers to the corpus of rabbinic literature that illuminates the Torah, which is the way by which we learn what the Torah means for our daily lives and for the arc of human history as we strive to create a lovelier and more caring and more loving world for every child, woman, and man who shares our time on earth. And that's what Midrash is all about. It's the corpus of literature that reflects the way in which the Jewish people have understood the Torah. The Midrash is where one learns the philosophy of the Jewish tradition, where one encounters Jewish imagination and the brilliant human insights of our sage rabbis who had an understanding of what it means to be a lovely and responsible human being in this often frightening and confusing, even painful world, but one also filled with joy and love. It's all found in Midrash. Elie Wiesel of blessed memory was a great teacher of Midrash in our generation, conveying what he learned from his beloved teacher, Saul Lieberman, a professor of Midrash at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America for more than 40 years. And one of the best books of Midrash you can read is Elie Wiesel's Messengers of God. In the second half of the 20th century, the great biblical scholar and teacher of Midrash, Nechama Leibowitz, of blessed memory, inspired a resurgence of Jewish learning and an appreciation of Midrash within the state of Israel and throughout the Jewish world. Here in America, the revered Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, of blessed memory, used Midrash to shape a profound contemporary understanding of Judaism that became the basis of modern Orthodoxy. At the Reform Movement's rabbinical school, HUCJAR, Rabbi Norman Cohn has influenced a generation of Reform rabbis through his teaching of Midrash. But perhaps the foremost American teacher of Midrash today is a superstar in the Jewish academic world, a rabbi who served in a whole host of educational and leadership positions at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, what's known to everyone as JTS, which is the conservative movement's rabbinical school, educational college, master's program, and cantorial school. My guest is Rabbi Burt Visotzky, who was ordained at JTS in 1977 and then for almost 45 years has been entrusted with heading many of JTS's most prestigious and influential divisions. Burt Visotzky is the former dean of JTS's Gershon Kext Graduate School. Burt served as director of the Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies at JTS. And Burt directs JTS's Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. Burt Visotzky's rabbinic career reflects a remarkable breadth and diversity of responsibility and leadership, hard to imagine for any one human being. And yet he's done it all. And again, what's most pertinent to this edition of L'Chaim? Burt Visotzky is a longtime professor of Midrash at JTS and one of the Jewish world's leading authorities and teachers of Midrash. By the way, he's written 10 books, among them Sage Tales, Wisdom and Wonder, the Rabbis of the Talmud. He's also written Reading the Book, Making the Bible a Timeless Text. He's written The Genesis of Ethics, how the tormented family of Genesis leads us to moral development. And he's written, Aphrodite and the Rabbis, how the Jews adapted Roman culture to create Judaism as we know it. Burt, what you have done is extraordinary, and I've always wanted you at this table. It is a thrill for me to have you here. Welcome to L'chaim, and thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much, Mark. I feel like I should just sit quiet now after that long introduction in which you so beautifully gave a definition of Midrash and really recounted some of my dear colleagues like Norman Cohn and my late teacher, Saul Lieberman. That was one thing Elie Wiesel and I shared in common.
Were you lucky? Were you lucky?
I was. I sat in Lieberman's class for 7 years. This is a Jew from the old country. He grew up in Motala. He went to the Slobodka Yeshiva. Professor Lieberman, apropos, you're talking about reading Bible, once said that at the Slobodka Yeshiva, they learned secular subjects.
Yes.
So we were, of course, like, what did you learn? And he said, Bible. Because for them, it was all Talmud all the time.
Yes.
So to have read Bible as a class, that was radical. At JTS, I really came right out of college. I've been there
Where'd you go to
ever
school?
since. I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago.
And then you came right to JTS.
I came to JTS, and then I took 1 year off during rabbinical school because I knew I was going to be teaching, and my bachelor's degree was actually in English language arts and literature.
Oh, fabulous.
I'm certified K through 12.
Fabulous.
But I took a year off and studied moral education and got a master's degree in education
Where?
as well at Harvard University. So it was. It's been a great education at JTS. I am the professor of Midrash. There has been, to the best of my knowledge, only one other person who was appointed professor in Midrash, who, amazingly, you neglected to mention. He wasn't my teacher personally, but certainly in spirit, and that was Mordechai Kaplan.
Well, Kaplan was an enormous influence in my own life. The founder and creator of Reconstructionist Judaism, and his story is both fascinating, complicated, and in many ways, people believe he has influenced what we experience as modern Judaism more than any other single Jew, including within Orthodoxy. And on a different show, I want to come back and talk to you about Mordechai Kaplan. You studied with him?
No, I didn't study with him, but certainly I studied his work.
But you're too young to have studied with him.
No, too young to have studied.
Yeah.
He was still alive, much as Heschel was still alive when I first came to JTS. My very first semester was Heschel's, as it were, last semester on
Did
Earth.
you study with him?
I got to sit at his feet at Shabbat,
Oh, my
listen
goodness.
to him talk. Heschel was a Chassid, actually meant to be the next Apter Rav, but then he went off to the university, and then he eventually made his way first to Hebrew Union College and then to JTS. So he was always a little bit of a fish out of water. Everyone else at JTS were misnagdim. They were Lithuanian types of Jews, hardcore academics. And I remember once one of them disdainfully referring to Heschel with the worst word he could think of. He said, Heschel is a poet. And I think that actually does capture Heschel. He really was a poet.
Yes.
He had a poetic soul. And because the poetry of his soul was something that moved him to embrace life fully, he didn't just stay within the confines of academics. He was out marching, as he would say, praying with his feet.
Yes.
So he marched with Martin King. He was against the Vietnam War, things that made him unusual in the JTS academic world, made him the great leader, the great rabbi he was for American Judaism.
He was a great writer. There are many books you and I could rattle off. I'm going to mention one of his smallest, unpretentious books, The Sabbath. It is one of the most gorgeous articulations of the essence and spirit of Shabbat, yes?
It's the perfect book to read on a Sabbath afternoon.
Isn't it?
It is.
Okay. I want to take one moment about you, then I want to move to Midrash. You're from Chicago.
Indeed.
How do you end up deciding you want to be a rabbi and then going to JTS?
Well, I'm not so sure I decided I wanted to be a rabbi. I had grown up in the conservative movement in Chicago, in my synagogue.
Who was your rabbi?
My rabbi, really, for many, many years, was a guy named Stan Schechter. He should live and be well. He's now a rabbi in Cleveland. For many years, he was a vice chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. But when I was a bar mitzvah boy, he was my rabbi. I was involved with the Ramah camp movement. I was involved with the United Synagogue Youth. And after college, I wanted to give myself the gift of a Jewish education. This was 1972. There were no graduate programs in Jewish studies at the time. That hadn't been invented. So the best and most efficient way for me to get a Jewish education was, ironically, to go to rabbinical school. So I went to rabbinical school.
So it was more for the education than to become a rabbi.
Indeed, I'm still at it for that.
Okay,
The education, the learning, the Jewish knowledge.
And you love it.
I love it very deeply.
Okay, and you never wanted to be a pulpit rabbi.
A congregational rabbi is a rough job.
It is.
And I often do scholar in residence, and I go out to congregations, and I see my colleagues, and I am just in awe of what they do leading their communities. The sacrifices they make, the living in a fishbowl, as we say, the ongoing attempt to teach Torah, to model Torah. I don't know that I could have endured that life, but when my colleagues do it, I am just so grateful to them because they're keeping American Judaism alive.
You told me a story off camera, and I told you to stop. And you can tell it as briefly as you want. What happens the day you're ordained, a rabbi by JTS?
Well, normally what happens is you dance, you sing, and you go out for dinner with your parents. I was ordained in May of 1977, and it was at the height of the Soviet Jewry movement. So I literally walked out of the ordination ceremony, wound up taking a helicopter to Kennedy Airport, and flew from there to Russia, to Soviet Asia actually, to visit Jews who had applied to leave Russia, had been refused. We called them in English refuseniks. Of course, when I got to Russia and said that, they're like, what? But I visited 8 different families throughout Soviet Asia.
You were roughly how old?
I was, in 1977, 25, 26 years old.
You were a kid.
I was a kid, a baby.
And under whose auspices did you fly to Russia?
Well, in those days, we weren't supposed to say it out loud, but I suppose I can now.
Now.
The State of Israel.
Mm-hmm. How were you recruited?
A lot of us were recruited for reasons that should be clear to everybody watching. Israeli people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs couldn't go into Russia to encourage Jews to make Aliyah. So what they did was kind of the next best thing. They recruited American Jews who were Zionists, but who had American passports, who were ready to go and serve the Jewish people and relate. We brought blue jeans. I literally went with a suitcase full of Levi's. And it turns out that Russians could sell those on the black market and eat for a month, which was good because many of them, once they applied to leave, had been then thrown out or fired from their work. So they needed somehow to survive. We brought them that. We brought them Russian, Hebrew dictionaries. We brought them all kind of things that would encourage them to, when they got out, to make Aliyah. I confess, many of them wanted to know what they could earn as a cab driver in New York. Mm-hmm. The truth is I didn't actually know the answer to that. But all of the families that I met with eventually got out. And because God has a delicious sense of humor, our in-tourist tour guide, I still remember her name, Mira Abdueva, on the very last day, had obviously figured out what I was doing, that I was sneaking away from the group. And she said, you know, my name sounds like it's a Muslim name, but I'm actually Jewish. And she proceeded to give us all the information we needed to get her an invitation to leave as well. So God looked out for us, and there were dozens and dozens and dozens of us who went on these kind of trips. I mean, we're talking about 1977. It's a long time ago. And thank God, most of the Jews not only have gotten out and moved to Israel, they have their own political party, which is flexing its muscle even today.
Yes, it is. Were there moments or experiences during that trip that stay with you?
Yes, we were terrified. We were kind of terrified the whole time. We were in Bukhara visiting a Jewish family. The guy picks up the phone, shouts for about 5 minutes in Russian. I didn't know Russian. Slams down the phone, looks at me and says, KGB. I'm like, what? KGB? Like, they know I'm here? Da, they know you're here. This was nervous-making, to say the least. But I knew I could get out and go home. I didn't know that my hosts would be able to get out. In fact, when I was visiting them then, their son had been arrested for the crime of teaching Hebrew. So we've come a long way. In the 90s, I was invited by the Russian government to teach in a program that JTS ran at the Russian State University of the Humanities. So we actually had a program in Jewish studies at a Russian university. Later, the provost of that university invited a colleague and me to edit a book about Judaism. We published it both in English and in Russian. In English, it's called From Mesopotamia to Modernity, 10 Introductions to Jewish History and Literature, which they wanted to put in their core curriculum so that Russian students would understand that the Jews are part of Russian history and the Jews had a contribution to the Western world. The hope was, of course, that it would tamp down anti-Semitism.
Do you feel you were appreciated by the people you met during that first trip?
Wildly, yes, of course.
Wildly.
They knew that I was coming a long way to visit them, but they also knew that if the KGB knew that Westerners were keeping an eye on them, they would be safe.
That's a fascinating story, and someday we'll also just talk about the Soviet Jewry movement and what an extraordinary time it was in the arc of it. And it's amazing that you were really, you started your rabbinic career that way.
Literally,
So
my first week as a rabbi.
good for you. Were you an observant Jew when you went to JTS? And I mean when you first went to JBS.
When I first went to JTS, I had already become an observant Jew. I grew up in a, what I think of as a typically conservative Jewish
Mainstream,
household.
yes.
Mainstream. We said Kiddush on Friday night,
Yep.
but my dad, may he rest in peace, went to work on Saturday morning. I, however, went to shul because
Yes.
it was right across the street, and I was always very comfortable there. We had a kosher home, but we ate out. At a certain point, right about bar mitzvah age, I stopped eating meat out. To this day, my practice is only to eat dairy out, and otherwise, I keep kosher in the house, and if I eat meat out, it's got to be at a kosher restaurant.
Okay. When you go to JTS, at the time you went, they were asking every student to basically live a halachic life.
They still do.
Was that hard for you?
No. A halachic life is a life of constraint. Earlier, I referred to Heschel as a poet. Poets write beauty because they write under certain constraints. Whether they're writing iambic pentameter or even a limerick, there are rules. And living by those rules allows someone to express themselves within a confined space. And at that point in my life, for sure, that confined space was very welcome to me. I was maturing, I was growing up, I needed an identity, and some of that identity had to be around my behavior. And Jewish law, halakha, is all about regulating behavior. For me, I also needed the other side of that coin, which was my soul, my neshama. So if Jewish law, halakha, is about behavior, Midrash is about my soul.
Good for you. We'll get that 1 minute. You're married.
I am.
Family?
Yes, 2 kids and a grandson.
Mazal tov.
Thank you.
That's fabulous. Does your wife share your perspective on Judaism?
So first, my current wife is my second wife. My first wife and I agreed on halachic detail from Aleph to Taf, from A to Z. Unfortunately, that was sometimes the only thing we agreed on. My current wife is not particularly observant, although she obviously, out of respect to me, we have a kosher home, so she is good about that. But she will do what she will do. I met her well after her bat mitzvah.
Yes.
She's an adult, and I have respect for her and
Okay.
her own Jewish identity.
Okay. Now I want you to see if you can remember the first time you had any notion of, introduction to, appreciation of Midrash. And the reason I say that is there are many American Jews who grew up in our generation. They had no idea what Midrash was. It was not something, it was not a word that was used a lot in the synagogue. A lot of rabbis, when we were growing up, had many concerns. Midrash was not one of them. And so it's amazing how many American Jews That's amazing. It's just a reality that many American Jews did not grow up with an appreciation of Midrash. And I'm going to tell you a story in a little while about Chaim Potok. But I want to know from you, was it during your Hebrew school? Was it during your Hebrew high school? Was it during your college? Was it once you got to JTS? At what point does this extraordinary, like the light goes on and you say to yourself, oh my goodness, because once a Jew gets it, and you not only have gotten it, you have written magnificently about it in ways that bring other Jews who may never have had it into this world. But I'm asking you, I want to know, Burt Visotzky, when is the first time Midrash passes your mind and your being at all?
So there's the difference between Midrash and Midrash per se. Because I was an English major in college, at some point that famous quote was taught to me that I'm actually speaking prose. And the truth is, probably every Jew who has any kind of a Jewish identity knows and is doing Midrash. They don't necessarily know they're doing it. If you've ever been at a Passover Seder, you're doing Midrash. Almost everybody grew up hearing this story, and it's a Midrashic story. It's actually first found in Genesis Rabbah, which is from the Galilee in the 4th, 5th century, told in Aramaic, the story about Abraham breaking the idols in his father's shop. And I remember how dismayed I was as a kid, looking through the Bible volume and said, well, where is that
You thought
story?
many Jews think that story is in the Torah.
So it's not. It's Midrash. It's a rabbinic narrative about Abraham, kind of giving him a backstory, if you will, as to what was it about him that allowed God to say, go, be my blessing. The thing is, I know exactly where I learned that story. I learned that story in a Hebrew reading book, a primer, called HaYehudi HaRishon, the first Jew. And it was the story of Abraham. And it was probably pitched at maybe a first grade reading level. 3-letter word, well, all Hebrew words have as a core 3-letter words. But it was very, very simple reading. And it told the story of Abraham in his father's idol shop and breaking the idols. And years later, probably I had finished writing my dissertation already, I thought, JTS has one of the greatest libraries in the world of Judaica. Maybe I could find that book. So I went to the library, and sure enough, there was the book with the same green cover with the orange stripe across it. And I looked, and I saw that the author was someone named Shlomo, I don't remember the first name, Greenberg. And I thought, there's a vice chancellor of the seminary with the same name. So I went and I asked him, Rabbi Greenberg, Simon Greenberg, may he rest in peace, did you write that book? He said, yeah, that's the first thing I wrote as a kid. I said, then I have a bone to pick with you. I said, because in that book, you don't distinguish between what's the pshat, as you said, what's the contextual reading of the Abraham story in the Torah, and Midrash, the Drash, the rabbinic narrative about Abraham. You make no distinction. And Cy Greenberg, in his wise way, scratches his head. Remind me, Burt, what are you getting your doctorate in? And I said, Midrash. He said, my work is done. So post facto, I realized that I must have learned Midrash almost simultaneously with learning Aleph Bet.
Okay. In some way, I understand the story very, very well, what you just told, and I appreciate it. It's not an answer to my question, though.
Oh, you caught that, huh?
I wanted to know if there was a time when cognitively you began to understand that there was Midrash, a body of literature, or a body of rabbinic sage interpretation that without which you couldn't read the Torah, and that with it, it made the Torah come alive in ways that nobody who doesn't know Midrash can appreciate.
I want to take it a step further and say something radical, which is without which not only could I not read the Torah, but without which I could not live my Jewish life.
You're fabulous, exactly.
So there was a moment. There was a point at which I came to realize, I had mentioned to you a little bit ago that I was an English major. And as an English major, I am schooled in reading stories. And something about the depth of the Midrashic story, what we call Agadah, rabbinic narrative.
Yes.
Agadah, the same word as Haggadah, like the Passover Haggadah. We tell our stories. And something about that rang a very deep bell inside me. And it was the kind of bell that made me realize that I was, in that moment, in harmony with God, the Jewish people, and the universe.
Yes.
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 And at that moment, JTS decided that they were going to open a graduate program in Midrash. So
Bashert,
absolutely. I was in the right place at the right time, and God truly has blessed me that way since that moment, even before that moment, but since that moment, to have the richness that I have. I'm 48 years now at the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Amazing.
And every one of them has been a blessing.
All right. So I did my introduction, and I appreciate your kind words, but I'm sitting with a world-renowned scholar here. If somebody walked into you and said, Burt, can you give me a sense of what Midrash is and why it's important? Why is it that not only can you not read the Torah without Midrash, but what you said is so beautiful. It's hard to be a Jew without a Midrashic understanding. What's the difference? If one said to you, Burt, if I just read the Torah, isn't that enough? Why isn't it enough for a Jew? And why is it when a Jew picks up a Chumash and he opens the page, as opposed to the Bible that's in the hotel room, in the drawer, where it's all scripture and text, anybody who opens a Chumash, a rabbinic Bible, a rabbinic Torah, the commentary on every page, the notes, the explanation, the interpretation, is very often lengthier than whatever piece of text is on that page. And that reflects a unique Jewish perspective. And so if somebody came in and said to you, okay, just explain to me why Midrash is at the heart of understanding what Judaism is, how do you answer?
My teacher, and when I say my teacher here, I mean literally, I was in a classroom of his, Louis Finkelstein. May he rest in peace.
You had the greatest.
I did. He was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I took a class with him, and he used to famously say, when I pray, I talk to God, and when I study, God talks to me. And I think that's part of the essence of Midrash, or the Midrashic process. We Jews entered a covenant with God. Now, that's a very unusual covenant for me, a creature, to be in relationship in some way with the creator of the universe. It's a very uneven relationship. And we believe that somehow the Torah reflects what God is asking of us. But that is a constantly changing phenomenon. God learned, boy did God learn, after creating Adam and Eve, that humans were a little more complicated than God had even counted on. And over 10 generations, from Adam to Noah, things went south very quickly. And God basically had to start all over. So God is on a constant learning curve of what God asks of us as well. So when we do Midrash, we're taking a very small text and we are engaging conversation. We are trying to talk to God. We're trying to figure out what God wants. We're trying to hear God's voice, that still small voice. We're trying desperately to have God hear our voice and know what our needs are. And sometimes study of Midrash helps us articulate our own spiritual needs. But it is the record of an ongoing conversation of the Jewish people with God from that moment at Sinai, all those centuries ago, unto this conversation right here.
There's a classic Midrash. Midrash is often found in Talmud. As you said earlier, it's not only in Talmud, but many of the most well-known Midrashim are from the actual Talmud, which is the legal basis of Judaism as well. So there's a Midrash in Bava Metzia 59. Lo b'shamayim hi. I want you to, from your perspective, why is that Midrash? Tell the Midrash, What's it mean to you? And what does it say to you about the process of Jewish learning and Jewish grappling with life?
So let me just, in one word, because I've learned as a teacher, it helps to give one word to explicate the lesson. The one word here is chutzpah, right? That the rabbis, God bless them, had incredible chutzpah. So the story begins with an issue of essentially kashrut. What is appropriate, fit, unfit in food. In the old days, they used to make an oven out of clay, very much like a modern crock pot, in fact. They would pile up clay, they'd put coal inside it, and as the coal heated up, the clay would harden, and you'd have a crock pot. You could cook that way. The trouble with clay is that it can very easily become ritually unfit, in Hebrew, tameh. So if a bug or a lizard skitters over it, it's unfit. The only way you can make it fit, basically, is to smash it. Not good, because then you constantly need a new supply of ovens. Along comes this guy named Ochnai, and as the rabbis say, he surrounded this oven like a snake would, the Greek word echidna, so there's a pun there, Ochnai, echidna, and he tried to make it kosher. What did he do? He put mixed layers of glass, clay, glass, clay. Now, people who keep kosher know that if you have glassware, it's almost always kosher. If it messes up, you just wash it off. So Ochnai thought, ooh, a self-koshering oven, right? I can put the glassware in, and he got if you will, a lobbyist, a champion, Rabbi Eliezer. And as the story in the Talmud goes, even though Rabbi Eliezer argued every argument under the sun for all day long, the sages did not accept his arguments. A former professor at JTS, may he rest in peace, Louis Ginsburg, kind of gave a Marxist reading. He said the rabbis were actually protecting the clay workers who were Jewish. I don't know whether that is historically the fact, but it does explain why they wouldn't accept Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabbi Eliezer got desperate. He said, if the halacha is the way I say it is, let this tree prove it. He points out the window, and a carob tree uproots itself and moves. Now, there's a disagreement, because some people have said it actually moved 100 cubits, a cubit. But other people said 400 cubits. This is, by the way, a great, great example of how the rabbis tell stories. Because now we're focused on, was it 100 cubits? Was it 400 cubits? Everybody agrees it happened, right? The only question is, how much did it happen? But the sages turned to Rabbi Eliezer and said, you can't bring a proof from a tree. He said, well, then let that aqueduct prove it. And the water flows backwards. Now, aqueducts work on the principle of gravity. So this is a pretty impressive miracle. But again, the rabbi said, you can't bring a legal proof from an aqueduct. So he says, let the walls of this Beit Midrash, of this academy, and the walls ominously begin to lean in. At which point one of the rabbis rebukes the walls. He says, mind your own business. Your job is to hold up the ceiling. Our job is to do halacha. And then the Talmud with a wink says, and those walls have been cockeyed ever since. So finally, Rabbi Eliezer, in one of those great moments, says, well, if the law's like me, let God prove it. And a voice comes from heaven. This is a rabbinic fantasy, right? Every rabbi wishes the day would come when the voice says, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? The law is always the way he says it is. And the rabbis say, quoting from Deuteronomy,
The Torah itself.
Lo bashamayim hi. It's not in heaven. As much as saying to God, mind your own business. They say, we have a principle. We follow the majority. Now, in saying that, they're also quoting Scripture, but they're not exactly quoting the whole verse of Scripture. Because if you look at it in its context, the pshat, what it actually says is, do not follow the majority to do ill. So they left out the not. So now we have, it's not in heaven, mind your own business, God. We're going to follow the majority, no matter what the Torah actually says. And with that, apparently Rabbi Eliezer does not accept their decision. continues to say this is kosher, and they excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer. So the same rabbi about whom God said the law is always like him is now an excommunicant. And the story really has a tragic ending because he remains excommunicated until his death.
That story says that the Jewish people take it upon themselves to constantly study, learn, and determine what Torah means. And in the Midrash, God says, my children have won. My children have won.
Yes.
I will stay out of it. God says in the...
Well, God doesn't actually say, I'll stay out of it.
Well, my children have won.
My children have outwitted me. They've won.
Not outwitted me. That's not fair. It doesn't say that. My children have won.
They defeated me. Fair enough.
Right. And the Gaon of Vilna says, using the word netzach, that the Torah will be eternal as long as this process continues, namely that the Jewish people will understand what Torah is. That is a commitment to understanding the Torah through a human lens.
Absolutely, utterly, and it really requires chutzpah. It's sometimes the chutzpah to say, God, you gave us a Torah, but you know what? Life on earth has changed.
Yes.
And we need to adjust it somehow. We need to grab it and grapple with it and look at what our ancestors did, but also look at what our children need. It requires the Torah to be a living document.
Oh, beautifully said. I'm asking this question as gently as I can because it may be a place where, as much as we agree on much of what we agree everything so far. Here we may disagree. You know, you said before that you're an English major, you've studied literature, that you understood at some point you're speaking, it's really prose poetry. And in my mind, the Jewish tradition understands that Torah is prose poetry. Mm-hmm. And the Midrash is the Jewish people, the sage rabbis who reflect what we are. It's their poetry to the poetry of the Torah. They tell a story about God. I don't imagine for one moment they're talking about the real God. I believe they're talking in poetic terms. I don't believe the rabbis ever thought there was a God in heaven who watches a debate, who's asked by a rabbi to intervene, and it really is the small voice, the still small voice that you referred to, that says, what do you hearken Eliezer for the laws as he says it is? But I don't believe that they meant that as a literal description of God. To me, this is, the entire Midrash is, the rabbis trying to articulate in the mashal that Maimonides talks about, the metaphor, the allegory, the truth of Torah. The truth of Torah is that the Jewish people must assume the responsibility to understanding what the Torah means in every generation. And as they do that, the Torah comes closer to what Heschel says is our understanding of the divine. That the Torah in and of itself doesn't start out to be perfectly reflective of what the God of this universe wants. And that the Jewish people are constantly trying to refine both Torah and understanding. And what is striking to me is what human insight the rabbis had in their creation of Midrash after Midrash, whether it's this one, whether it's Nachshon ben Aminadav, whether it's Hillel trying to articulate in one verse the essence of Torah. All of these are an attempt to describe the rabbi's sensitivity to the human condition, and they tell a story. But it's not that they think the story is literal. And when you tell it, I'm wondering to myself, is Burt telling me that he thinks the Talmud is a newspaper account of what happened one day in a yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael in ancient times? Or is he saying, there's a story the rabbis created that has a point. And the point is, lo, bashamayim he. The Torah is not in heaven. It is in our mouths and in our hearts. And the challenge of being a Jew in every generation is to try to constantly reinterpret and understand Torah. And that's what the Midrash is.
So, Rabbi, and I'm going to say Rabbi because now I'm going to respectfully disagree with you.
That's
so
all
we're going
right.
to have a rabbinic dispute.
It's all right.
I think you're right, and I think you're wrong.
That's rabbinic.
I think you're right in that the rabbis deeply appreciate the power of story. Story is how we create our Jewish identity. I said earlier there's a distinction between law and agadah, and narrative. But the truth is there's Midrash halacha. Sometimes we use Midrash to determine how God wants us to behave.
Absolutely.
Sometimes we use Midrash to determine what is our Jewish identity, what is the shape of my neshama. That said, I want to say two things, three things, four things. The first is that the rabbis believe their stories to be true.
How do you know?
But let me define that. Because I believe, and I believe with all my heart, that some of the profoundest truths we learn from reading fiction.
Yes, and by the way, if you mean true as opposed to factual, I agree 100%.
Okay, so we're on the same
100%.
page there. Is this factual? I think it runs up against a hard surface. And let me explain what it is. And in doing that, I want to contrast Maimonides' idea of God. Maimonides is a very austere Aristotelian. His God is with a W, wholly other. The best Maimonides will tell you is what God is not.
Right.
The rabbis are telling stories not because they want God to be a metaphor, but because they want God to be a vital reality in your life. Right now, the Jewish community, like the rest of the world, is experiencing absolute terror over the coronavirus.
We're meeting during the early days of the coronavirus.
Indeed. And the truth is, we need to know that if we pray, God will hear us.
What does that mean, Burt?
It
Burt,
means...
are you suggesting that God will save people from the virus?
No. I'm
No.
suggesting that God might give physicians sufficient intelligence to save people.
Okay,
from the
so you're
virus.
saying to me there's a stupid physician, God will somehow put intelligence into his mind?
Well, I'm not sure anybody too stupid gets through medical school, but
Moderately stupid.
I would love to believe that this is a quote of one of Jack Neusner's 1,000 books. The glory of God is intelligence. So God gave us the brains that we have. God created us as human beings. Literally, I'm not insisting on a literal creation. It could be that God set evolution into
Bowie,
notion.
we agree. Bowie, if you're talking in metaphor, I have no problem. Here's what I worry about.
But
I worry about that somebody's going to listen to hear you today
Mm-hmm.
and think that what you mean is there's a scientist or a physician working over a project, and God says to himself, "Oh, if I only kind of give him one more little piece of information or push him in a way, he'll get it." And God does that, as opposed to saying, God creates all of us with all kinds of potential. Our job is to develop that potential in a divine way.
I'm certainly on board. I'm not going to disagree with that. That's absolutely right. But, and the but is really profound, when people are frightened, they need to know that there is a listening ear. They need to know that if they whisper a prayer, there's something that cares about them. And I think that's why the rabbis have some literal belief in the reality of God.
Okay, just to make sure everybody understands you, does God have an ear?
So this is interesting because, of course, according to the Torah, God does have an ear. The Torah describes God in incredibly
Right, and do the rabbis accept that in the Midrash?
So some do, some don't, and Maimonides absolutely rejects it. Maimonides says, I want no part of anthropomorphism, explaining God as though God had a body, and then he takes it a step further. He says, I want no part of anthropopathism.
Yes, and Bowie, do the rabbis let
Right.
us,
I don't want God to have emotion like
do
humans.
the rabbis let you draw a picture of God?
Me?
Anybody.
Anybody can draw a picture of God. It just won't be accurate.
You're not supposed to draw pictures of God. In the Jewish tradition, you don't draw a picture of God. There's even questions as to whether you draw anything, but you certainly don't draw God. That's idolatry.
The second commandment.
God doesn't have a body. The rabbis don't believe God is. The rabbis talk about God as if God was because, and you said it very profoundly, there is an attempt for us to have a relationship. And what we know most in relationships is human beings. So we talk about we talk about God as if, kivyachol, as if God. But to the rabbis, God isn't a person.
So you said it beautifully.
God doesn't have an ear or a hand. And the rabbis do, there's a drash after drash after drash. What does it mean to say God has a hand and an arm and brought us out and he has a back? This famous story of the rabbi, of Moses in the cleft in the rock. They say it's not a literal back.
By the way, if it were true that at that moment God showed Moses God's tachlis, we should have understood what the rest of Jewish history would look like. Absolutely.
I love you.
But
you understand what I'm saying.
I do.
And you say,
and
you
I don't
teach
disagree.
this. You teach
The
this.
rabbis always go to metaphor.
Okay,
they
and-
are uncomfortable.
Right. And so why is it hard for you to say?
Because Yochanan Mufs was my teacher. And Yochanan, may he rest in peace, had a very profound truth. He said, we are not biblical Jews, we are rabbinic Jews, but we never give up the pshat of the Bible. And that means we have a very complicated picture of God. We have God as metaphor, but we also have God as a very living reality. He wrote a book called The Personhood of God. And Mufs was completely aware of the fact that what he was doing was making Jews very uncomfortable because it sounds like the embodied God of Christianity. But he said, we live for relationship. And if you totally take away the physicality of God, the here-ness of God, the immanence of God, then it's impossible to have a relationship. So he said the Bible gives us the language of the body, of the emotion, so that we can relate to God.
Yes.
So that when we're desperate, we do think there is a listening ear. If you ask someone who's desperate and is praying, is there a listening ear? They're going to tell you, yeah. If you ask them literally, they're going to look at you like this because they don't want to hear that at that moment. At that moment, they have emotional need that God can fill.
And I don't believe anybody, and certainly a rabbi, has to give them a philosophical course in the midst of pain. Somebody's in pain, they have the right to feel it, but we're talking outside of pain. And outside of pain, I believe the rabbis say something very profoundly true. What's true is that there is a God in this universe, and we don't know what this God is because God is other.
Right.
And God is not a male. God doesn't have genitals. God doesn't have a beard. God doesn't walk around with a stick and beat you up. And then there's the Torah, which has all these stories about God as if God were a character. And God is a character in morality plays in the Torah. That doesn't mean there is no God, but it does mean that the Torah is an attempt to articulate in language the ineffable. And that's why Maimonides, who you define so well, he has no problem. He is on the extreme, but he has and he requires us to believe in God. Maimonides does. At the same time, he says, there's no kisei in heaven. There's no throne. That's a metaphor. And it stands for a certain sense of our being in awe of the divinity of God, the sovereignty of God. And that's what all of the Torah is. And then the Midrash takes it. The Midrash takes a book that is very God-centric and turns the Jewish tradition into not humanism, but it becomes very humanistic.
Yes, and I still am not going to let go. I'll tell you why. Because in the prayer book, we say, and it sounds very Christian, but it's there. I mean, it's there all over the Torah, and it's there all over the Siddur, the prayer book, which is a rabbinic Jewish invention. It says really clearly, God loves you. I'm going to look right at the camera. God loves you. That is a very powerful message.
Absolutely.
And we can only hear that message if we imagine a God that has some anthropomorphic, anthropopathic character. It just can't be the first cause or something like that. You also said something which I think is really on point, which is the character of God. I mentioned my teachers, Lieberman and Yochanan Mufs. So Yochanan told me the following story. He said, Lieberman once said, Mufs, you're a Bible scholar. Who is the most tragic character in the Bible? Some Mufs didn't have to think very hard. He said, Jeremiah. Lieberman said, no, not Jeremiah. Ezekiel? No, not Ezekiel. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. No, Mufs. The most tragic character in the Bible is God. And there's profound truth there, too.
Oh, I love it.
That the tragedy, the pathos, I'm sounding a little bit like Heschel, is powerful, not just for the Jewish people, but for all humanity. That if we believe there is something greater than us, we also desperately want to believe that that something that is greater than us actually cares about us.
Amen.
Amen.
Absolutely. I could do this forever with you, so you have to promise to come back to do nothing but talk more Midrash. Will you do it?
I would be delighted.
You are wonderful.
Well, and it's wonderful to have you as a chavruta. You're such a good conversation partner for this.
That's very sweet of you. Burt Visotzky, professor of Midrash at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, one of the most gifted teachers of rabbinic commentary in the American rabbinate today. It's been an honor for me to sit with him and to share ideas with him. As always, I invite you to be in touch with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of this discussion on L'chaim with Burt. Please email me this week at rabbigolub@jbstv.org. I love hearing from you. And if you want to be in touch with Rabbi Visotzky of Burt, you email me and I will pass your emails on to him. Also, remember, you can now listen to the L'chaim podcast wherever you go, to listen to past editions of L'chaim or to enjoy this conversation. Download the L'chaim podcast wherever you download your podcast. Take us with you. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.